Hello, and welcome to the session, the Value of Understanding Your Genetics, Demystifying the Rare Disease Experience. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to share with you some insights on rare disease. Tomorrow is actually Rare Disease Day. There are over 25 million people in the US living with rare diseases. This session is supported by Global Genes. Global Genes is a nonprofit umbrella organization supporting patients and families and caregivers in the rare disease community. You can learn more about Global Genes by going to their booth at this conference. Please note, if you have any questions during the panel, we welcome you to please put them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address them as time allows. I would now like to introduce myself. My name is Tricha Shivas. I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategic Partnerships at the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. Sarcoidosis is a rare inflammatory disease that can impact any organ of the body. African Americans are 2 times more likely to suffer from sarcoidosis than their white counterparts. I invite you to learn more at www.stopsarcoidosis.org. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists, Starling and Dr. Ahmar Zaidi. I will ask each of you to please introduce yourselves and explain a little bit about how the work that you're doing touches the Black community. Arquez, would you please go first?
Thank you, Tricia. I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to thank the Black Health Matters and Global Gene organizations for allowing us to participate in such crucial conversations about understanding your genes and certainly the impact of rare disease on the African community. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Starling. I'm the founder and CEO of Revelis Clinical Services. Revelis is a clinical research support company that is accelerating the clinical development by allowing patients with rare and complex diseases to engage in clinical trials in the comfort of their home. As a pharmacist by training, I've spent nearly 18 years of my life leading specialty pharmacy and clinical research support organizations for patients with rare diseases such as hemophilia, autoimmune, chronic diseases, chronic kidney disease, as well as oncology. So today's discussions are so important. However, for me, they're actually personal and spiritual. I witnessed firsthand the challenges associated with my mother being diagnosed with a rare lung disorder. For nearly 2 years, I witnessed my mother go from specialist to specialist, procedure after procedure, the final journey or her odyssey, only to learn that she actually had a rare disease, and then to be quickly met with the fact that there was no FDA-approved treatment. So naturally, we turned to evaluating, participating in clinical trials. We learned that there actually were clinical trials available. However, they were not accessible to my mother due to the need to travel and overnight accommodations. And so frustrated by this experience, I've actually made it my life work to really address the lack of access and the awareness for clinical trials by providing a solution known as decentralized clinical trial approaches. Our organization's specific attention is really on fostering diversity and inclusion for patients that are racial and ethnic minorities to be able to participate in clinical trials. And so as our nation is centered around such a important topics of racial and social inequities, and as COVID-19 pandemic turns across our world and our nation, so many people are determined not to give in to their fears and certainly not to lose hope. And at Revelis, our mission is to bring that hope closer to home so more patients can participate in clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arquez. And I would now like to introduce Dr. Zaidi. Would you please share a little bit about how your work is impacting the Black community?
Sure. First of all, thank you to the Black Health Matters and Global Genes team. This is such an important conversation. I am a pediatric hematologist. I take care of individuals with sickle cell disease here in Detroit. It's my honor and privilege to take care of almost 800 children with sickle cell disease here. As many of you know, sickle cell disease is, of the rare diseases, one of the more common rare diseases, with 100,000 Americans afflicted by the disease. There's about 1 child born every hour with sickle cell disease in this country. When we talk about sickle cell trait, it's an even more pervasive problem, right? We have 1 in 12 African American births with sickle cell trait, which, as we're learning more and more about, is also something that requires some monitoring. My journey on this path, though, started much earlier. My journey on this path started in 1999 when my nephew was born with sickle cell trait. And up to that point, it had never crossed my mind as a young high school student that sickle cell disease is something that happens in the non-Black community, right? In the brown community, in the Pakistani Indian community. And then I had the fortune of going to medical school in the West Indies. And when I went there, something really cool happened. I was able to observe sickle cell disease in a developing country. And I got to see how people take care of sickle cell disease when they don't have resources. But I also got to see how much empathy and respect the disease got in that developing country. And when I came back to the United States, I expected even better. I thought, wow, I'm going back to a country that's going to have resources, blood banks, new therapies. Things are going to be better. But I saw patients and the way that they were treated without empathy and without compassion, without respect. And I saw the disease of racism and bias and prejudice that afflicts the medical system in America. And it became clear to me that I was going to dedicate myself to this cause. And that's sort of how I ended up where I am today.
Great, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your experiences and your stories. I want to start off by having a discussion about how you think the diagnosis of rare disease can change the life of individuals, and especially for those who are African American. So Dr. Zaidi, why don't you start us off this time?
The entire sort of the history, the medical history of the African American community here, and I'm going to talk from a lens of sickle cell disease, right? This is a rare disease when we talk about sickle cell disease that exists in this country as a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade. And the way that the American healthcare system has built upon really the oppression of the Black community as it's gone through medical research has resulted in an environment that is particularly difficult to navigate, not only as a patient, but also as a provider, as an industry partner, as an advocate, whoever you may be. Because what we have is a biopsychosocial disease, and this is true of all rare diseases, right? Every rare disease has a biologic aspect, but it also has a psychosocial aspect. And we have this problem of putting people into boxes, right? And the most common box we use, unfortunately, is the color of someone's skin. Despite the fact that biologically, out of the 25,000 genes that make up a human body, only 6 of them control the color of your skin. It's the least important thing, right? The color of your skin is the least important thing, but we tend to box people specifically by that one marker. And when you do that, what you do is you obscure your view of the disease. And this is true of any rare disease then, right? We know that the Black community has poor outcomes across any spectrum: pregnancy, colon cancer, prostate cancer, chronic kidney disease, stroke, you name it. And what we see then in medical textbooks is risk factor Black, when really what it should say is risk factor is racism. And because that's what drives this. That's what drives this, is we're really in a situation where this is a me problem. You know, this is a provider, a healthcare problem. This is not a patient problem. So I think it's going to require, you know, a little bit of reframing when we talk about rare disease in the Black community, into understanding the microenvironment here.
Thank you for that background. And Arquez, would you like to weigh in as well?
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Zaidi did a great job really framing some of those considerations. What I would care to add is that there often are many extraordinary challenges for patients of color with living with rare diseases, particularly around the diagnostics. What we see is, you know, starting with one particular area, it's just a consideration around understanding and ignoring early symptoms and discomforts and signs. And I think about, you know, growing up as a kid in rural East Texas, you're often taught culturally, to man up and to ignore these symptoms and not to, you know, obviously give in to the fact that these symptoms could develop and we actually don't seek care. And so what we see with many rare disease patients is as these new symptoms begin to develop, they may even appear unrelated. And so oftentimes by the time that the patients seek appropriate intervention, healthcare intervention, it's often too late. The other piece of the diagnostic odyssey is is often just a lack of comprehensive and adequate testing to obtain an accurate diagnosis. So many patients will go through clinical procedures, being sedated for imaging assessments, an endless array of testing by dozens of medical specialists, only to actually have no answers, but more questions. And so this is a very frustrating consideration for patients with rare diseases. And so really addressing, obviously some of the challenges around adequate testing, and then lack of clinician knowledge and understanding of some of these diseases. And I think furthermore, one of the things that I experienced personally is that when my mother was actually seeking, advice, she was somewhat embarrassed by this notion of getting a second opinion. She felt that it was, she didn't feel right, and here I was understanding that she had a right to get a second opinion. And so those are some things that I would just, offer up in terms of considerations, is that patients should feel empowered to, obviously seek a second opinion and ask their healthcare providers about their particular diagnostic journey.
Thank you, Eric. And building off of that just a little bit, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how you think we might do a better job inviting the African American community into clinical care, and also, since your expertise is in clinical trials as well.
Well, I can tell you that, some of the challenges that we face for patients of color to participate in clinical trials, there are many, particularly with a well-earned history of mistrust for people of color, particularly African American. We do, even in my lifetime, and we've seen just recently, in 1972 with the Tuskegee syphilis, study, and so many people have knowledge and history of that, and so often what we have to do is deal with the fact that yes, that mistrust is there. However, it doesn't mean that patients are not willing to participate in clinical trials. We need to acknowledge that certainly that we have scar tissue from that history, but many patients would be willing and able. And so we need to think about, how do we address some of the social economic issues, such as financial barriers, lack of transportation, childcare, and there's general awareness. There are so many patients that are just not aware of why participating in a clinical trial is important. And I think what we've seen recently with COVID-19 are, we've been really centered around issues around why it's important to participate in clinical trials. And so I offer that up in terms of, thinking that it's really important. Many patients with rare diseases, often a part of their treatment is solely and primarily as a result of participating in clinical trials. So it's so important. And I'm so delighted that we're having this discussion.
I'm going to jump in, and Dr. Zaidi, we got a question, I think, that will tie into this part of the discussion. Specifically, we had someone who asked how young adults can avoid being labeled as drug seeking when they go to deal with being in pain, specifically for sickle cell, but other reasons as well.
Sure. Can I just add on to that clinical trial participation question really quickly?
Please,
from a sickle cell
absolutely.
lens?
Yeah, please.
So the first patient with sickle cell disease comes to America in 1904, right? That we know of, probably certainly earlier than that. It takes until 1999 to get the first drug approved. And then from 1999, it takes until 2017 for the next one, and then 2019 for the next two. We've got a child being born every hour with sickle cell disease. The approval of these new drugs comes because something beautiful happens. In each of these trials, 200 plus patients with sickle cell disease said, you know what? Acknowledging the history that exists in this country, acknowledging, as Ark has said, the scar tissue that exists, acknowledging that the medical field has completely violated our trust, we're still going to go ahead and say, we're going to participate in this trial. We're going to give you another chance. And from that, something beautiful happens, right? We get new therapies in sickle cell disease. So while it's important to acknowledge our history as people who have oppressed minority communities, specifically the Black community, under a farce of medical science, it's also important to remember that history is not always what happened 50 years ago. right? History is also what happened a month ago and a week ago and an hour ago. And taking a chance on science now is going to pay off. Science now looks very different. As Ark has stated beautifully, the way that things are going in 2020 has shown us that advances matter and can happen when you trust science. So going now to the next question, which was about being labeled a drug seeker. So there's a couple things here. The first thing is that we can't teach empathy, right? You can't teach empathy to a physician. That's something that you have or you don't. What you can do is recognize that there are national guidelines, national benchmarks around the care of sickle cell disease patients, and arm yourself with those. Use those as weapons. Walk in and say, hey, the NHLBI guidelines say that I should get treated with pain medicine up front within 60 minutes of my arrival here. Let them understand that you know more about sickle cell disease in that moment than they do, because chances are that's the case. Doctors learn about sickle cell disease from sickle cell disease patients, and chances are, if you're dealing with a doctor like that, they haven't seen many sickle cell disease patients. So you're the expert in the room at that moment. And then escalate up that advocacy ladder. Find the patient advocate, go up towards administration, and then advocate for yourself when you're feeling well. That would be my advice.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to, we got a question here about how, with the money that's being raised by advocates in rare disease and other spaces, why do you guys think that research is taking so long? And I'll start with you, Arquez.
Well, it's a really good question, particularly with what we've experienced recently with Operation Warp Speed. So I can tell you one of the most pervasive challenges across the clinical development process is recruiting and retaining patients. And you think about the actual average time that it takes a product to actually make its journey across the multiple phases of the clinical development. It takes about 12 years. And often a lot of that time is associated with challenges around retaining and recruiting patients. Nearly 80% of trials actually fail to actually finish on time. Nearly 85% of trials fail to meet their enrollment targets. And then 20% of our trials are actually delayed greater than 6 months. And so what you see is that challenges associated with recruiting and retaining patients in these clinical trials often exacerbates the actual time that it takes to bring these new innovative therapies to the marketplace. And so the real response or call to action is that more patients, we need more patients that are willing to participate and aware of, again, how important it is to participate in clinical trials. And I'll tell you why it's important that we think about diversity and why it matters for this audience. We know that 1 in 5 FDA-approved therapies demonstrate some different exposure or response across racial and ethnic groups. We have data and we have evidence that supports that we know that products react differently to different colors. So it's really important that clinical trials reflect the population that the products are intended for.
Yes, thank you so much. And just building on that, Dr. Zaidi, we got some questions about how people can trust science given what is going on, what has gone on in the past. And so there's a lot of questions about protecting the people of color's money and avoiding scams. How can they trust science? What are your thoughts on that?
Trust is earned. So I recognize that we've lost it. And I think acknowledging that we have lost the trust of minority communities is important to state up front. I think one thing to also recognize is because of what historically has happened, things have changed dramatically, right? We have now very strict and tight regulations around the treatment of patients during clinical trials. We have seen, for example, the suspension of clinical trials at the first whiff of something going wrong, right? Something not going the way it's supposed to. Every clinical trial comes with a set of unbiased people that are monitoring for safety problems, right? Arquez can probably speak to, data monitoring safety boards and the regulations around getting research open. Science looks very different now. And that's visible. For example, one of the recently approved medications in sickle cell disease was called GBT 440. Now, what that means is there were 439 compounds that they tried before 440, right? And that shows you the amount of science that sometimes goes into getting to finally something that works. And then once you're there, the amount that's required from the FDA to get approved is just immense. And I'd love to hear Arquez's take on that and his role and the regulatory aspects of his job.
Yeah,
And
Dr.
Arquez,
Zaidi.
can I just jump in for 1 second? While you're approaching that, can you also maybe address a little bit about the vaccine? Because I think in that same vein, there's a lot of concerns that are being raised here about whether the vaccine was put out too quickly, and maybe you can address that as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to distinguish between, political propaganda and just the fact that you're getting accurate and reliable information from, you're from the scientists in the medical community, and that's so important. It's so important that that we have reliable sources where where people can get information. And so what I've actually had to do is facilitate conversations with even healthcare providers who are well educated in their concerns and certain perceptions and attitudes about that, because we were able to accelerate the clinical development within less than a year to bring these new therapies to these vaccines, is that there was ultimately the unintended consequence was that there's a lax in quality, and that isn't the case. What you saw is unprecedented in our industry, with intense collaboration between organizations and scientists to accelerate that. So I want to again just underscore that the vaccines that have been approved today, they are safe, they are reliable, and they are effective. And so we should encourage everyone obviously to evaluate. Obviously, we can't tell you and can't mandate you to get the vaccine, but we strongly encourage you to look into it and make sure you're getting accurate and reliable information to support your decision.
Thank you for that as well. And so we have heard from some others who are interested. Dr. Zaidi, if you could give some guidance on where they might be able to find the national guidelines for sickle cell disease.
Sure. So the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the NHLBI, published guidelines in 2014 on the clinical management of sickle cell disease. There are guidelines being updated. They're being published by the American Society of Hematology, which is another place to look. Those would be the starting spots. That's where I would go to look for those clinical practice guidelines.
Thank you. And Dr. Zaidi, I also see here a couple of questions that are asking about training and how training can maybe help improve both science and some of the issues that you had previously identified.
Sure. So specifically, what kind of training I'm curious about. So training of who would be my question back. So training in the sense of, are we looking to have sensitivity training about the people that sickle cell disease patients interact with regularly? I think that's mandatory. I think that's necessary. Like I said, earlier in my talk, if anyone was there, one thing I think is important to acknowledge is that we all have bias, and I think it's important for us to recognize that we all have bias. And I'm talking specifically about the physicians and the provider community. For me, recognizing my bias made me a better sickle cell physician. Being able to say that I have a bias was something that was empowering, because it made me understand that I have a blind spot and that I should look at my blind spot. So I think along the way, yes, training programs are going to be important, and improving the way we approach minority health, not only at the medical school level, but everywhere, pharmacy, nursing. We're going to have to start from the bottom and work our way up.
Arquez, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, with regards to training, I think one of this is we think about how we, continue to foster trust and to overall increase the participation for African Americans is that we need to really begin to look at some of those barriers and areas in which we can improve. And one of the things that I would strongly, support here is that we look at the workforce. How do we continue to increase the amount of clinicians and clinical researchers and pharmacists and and other healthcare practitioners that are engaging in clinical trials? We know that from listening to patients, and our industry has used the buzzword of being patient centric. As we listen to patients, patients are telling us that it certainly aids and it is notably improves the actual outcomes when you have patients that look like them. And so one of the areas that we certainly can help improve diversity in clinical trials is having a more diverse workforce.
Thank you. So we've also gotten some questions about resources, and if you could weigh in, we have a question about where individuals can find out more about clinical trials that might be relevant to them, specifically one here about children with sickle cell disease, but also in general about rare disease. Where can people go in order to find out more about clinical trials?
So
go ahead, Dr.
I was going to just say, so my go-to is clinicaltrials.gov, which is the national registry for all clinical trials. You can just search a diagnosis and it'll show you what's open, where it's open, who the physicians are, and who to contact. I think that's the best starting point.
Arquez, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I did. In addition to clinical trials, clinicaltrials.com, certainly that is certainly a great resource. There are many online resources and patient advocacy groups and foundations, organizations like Global Genes, Rare Disease, Diversity Coalition, the National Organization for Rare Disorders, and even looking at the National Institute of Health, the Genetic and Rare Disease Information Center. These are all great resources for patients that are looking to gain more knowledge, increase their awareness, and ultimately gain access to information about active and ongoing clinical trials that are available to patients.
Thank you both. So we are actually coming up on our time here, and I want to give the opportunity for each of you to say a little bit about what you would like to have the takeaways from this session be for those who have attended. And so Dr. Zaidi, would you start? And then Arquez, you can close it out.
So I think a couple things. The way that we need to start approaching disease is really in finding allyship, right? It is really in understanding that we will accomplish more united as a team at every layer of the healthcare system than we will on opposite sides. I think ensuring that you have a physician who hears your concerns, who takes time to listen to you is very important. And also understanding that the era of science that we're in now is very different than it was decades ago. Acknowledging the trauma that's come in the oppression of minority communities through medical research, and also understanding the power that exists in a rare disease patient in the form of them holding the answer to the question of how do we treat something lies in their blood, is a very powerful thing to have. So recognizing that you are the most powerful piece in this equation should allow you to empower yourself and find allies and build your village that it's going to take to have the best possible life.
And Arquez, you have 1 minute, so I'm sorry, but if you can close us out with some brilliance, that would be
no worries.
fantastic.
I'll be brief. I think when we look at what is estimated for 2050, that nearly 50% of the U.S. population is projected to be other than non-Hispanic white, and so it's so important that we think about why that African Americans representing nearly 16% of the population and Hispanics representing nearly 18%, but yet we only have less than 5% participating in clinical trials. So it's so important that we address the lack of diversity because the lack of diversity only exacerbates health disparities from between race and racial minorities. So it's really important. The takeaway message is we need patients to participate in clinical trials because we have a very changing demographic in our nation.
Thank you both for this informative session, and thank you again to Black Health Matters for inviting us to be a part of this discussion. And thank you for all who attended and participated by asking questions and helping to move this session along. And enjoy the rest of the conference.